All too often, we remember the Roman wars without considering the Roman peace which followed. This is an issue for understanding history properly, since the vast majority of the people lived their lives away from that bleeding edge of civilization. After all, it was the stability of the Roman Empire which was its greatest claim to fame. Therefore, in this episode, we'll be kicking off a series on law and order in ancient Rome by starting off with its very foundations, the law. I spend a lot of time reading history books to make these documentaries, yet I still find myself with a growing list of titles I just don't have time to get to. I'm sure in your own busy life it can be tough to find the time to explore as many books as you'd like. Thankfully, our sponsor Blinkist has a solution. Blinkist is an app that takes thousands of non-fiction books and uses experts to distill them down to their most essential ideas for you to easily digest with text or audio in just 15 minutes. This can be super helpful for engaging with subjects you'd never otherwise get to, or for making a short list of the books you definitely want to read in full. As an example, I've finally been able to delve into Stephen Levitt's Freakonomics, Yuval Harari's Sapiens, and Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. It's honestly been extremely liberating and a huge breath of fresh air for my ever-curious mind. You can check it out right now by clicking the link in the description below to get a 7-day free trial. In addition, the first 100 people will get 25% off a full membership. So check it out. The evolution of Roman law began in the early days of the monarchy. It is here in the 8th century BC that the Roman jurist Sextus Pomponius claims that the people began their first activities without any fixed laws and without any fixed rights. All things were ruled despotically by kings. While this assessment holds some merit, we should at the same time realize that no society is truly ever lawless. Communities always have some way to organize themselves and regulate the actions of their members. In these early days, this occurred across the basic levels of society. The lowest of these tiers was the family group. At this level, the father, or paterfamilias, held the most power. His word was law. Above this level would be the interactions between neighbors in the community. Their actions were governed by customary laws, which had arisen organically to deal with common issues like marriage, property, theft, and murder. Informing these ideas would have been religious beliefs, which were regulated by the priesthood. Next level up would have been the ruling class of the patricians, with the king at their head. Their laws were commonly delivered in the form of royal decrees to the city, or in the form of rulings passed in judgment of petitioners to the king's court. The main takeaway here is that while yes, there were indeed laws, none of them were codified, and they could change from year to year at the slightest whim of the upper classes. Basically, everyone else chafed under such conditions. These non-elite Romans, known as the plebeians, were literally second-class citizens. They were unable to appeal legal judgments, unable to vote in the assembly, unable to hold high office, and even forbidden the right to full marriage with anyone in the patrician class. From the perspective of the majority of the population, it was indeed a despotic time. When the kings were chased from Rome in 490 BC, the plebeians saw a chance to have their voices heard. Yet the elite were in no mood to share power within the new republican government. This began the so-called conflict of the orders, a socio-political struggle that would run the course of Roman history for centuries to come. To break the initial status quo, the furious plebeians staged a massive public protest whereby they abandoned the city of Rome en masse, refusing to take up arms as enemy armies closed in. This finally forced the patricians to make some concessions. As a result, a new set of government magistrates were formed, the tribunes of the plebs. They were positions exclusively limited to the plebeian class, with the power to propose legislation, intervene in legal matters, and veto the actions of other magistrates. The common people finally had a say in the law. Their next move would be to tackle its arbitrary nature by demanding the law be physically written down. Thus, the 12 tables were written. They were not a constitution as we would understand today, but rather just a compilation of some existing customary laws, most of which reflected the rural aspects of the people it governed. As an example, you can find passages specifying the width of roads, punishment for grazing in someone else's fields, and even death penalties for singing abusive songs about others. These eclectic laws were originally carved on wooden tablets and set up for public display. Eventually, they were upgraded to bronze for the sake of permanence, and, for hundreds of years, Romans would memorize their contents. While certainly an important achievement, the 12 tables were quickly altered or added to by new laws throughout the history of the Republic. With this in mind, let's now turn to see how such lawmaking took place. The laws themselves were initially formed in the popular assemblies. There were 3 different types of these: the Centuriate Assembly for high elections and military affairs, the Tribal Assembly for lower elections, and the Plebeian Assembly for matters that affected only the lower classes. Initially, laws, after a consultation with the Senate, were proposed to the people, who would have time to meet among themselves to discuss it. On the day when the Tribal Assembly was called, the adult male citizens would meet together. No discussion was held at this meeting, only the vote. Individual votes were tallied within groups of people, which in turn got to cast one vote as a whole. In the Tribal Assembly, there were 31 rural tribes, dominated by rich landholders, and only 4 urban tribes for the poorer and more numerous city dwellers. The end result was a lopsided vote, whereby the smaller number of patricians maintained control. After a law was passed, it was given the blessing of the Senate, inscribed on either a bronze or marble tablet and placed in Rome's treasury. The text contained 3 parts. 1. The preamble, containing the sponsor, the votes in support, and the date of adoption. 2. The main text of the law, which was broken into sections. And 3. The sanctio, listing penalties for breaking the law. So what kinds of laws were being passed? Well, you had all kinds of things that you might encounter today. There were private laws for individuals, families, businesses, and small groups. This included things like marriage, divorce, succession, contracts, and property rights. There were also public laws for dealing with issues for society as a whole, like administration, the Constitution, and crime. This of course worked much better on paper than it did in reality, as there were quickly many laws which overlapped with others or were simply outdated. In addition, as Rome's borders grew, it had to deal with the fact that it now controlled an increasing number of non-citizens who were not covered by early laws. In many cases, local laws were simply allowed to stand, with Roman magistrates interceding as necessary. Over time, however, Roman law would expand to deal with these provincial subjects. Adding to this mess was the conflict of the orders, whereby the plebeian city dwellers were constantly fighting for more rights and privileges. By 287 BC, they had won a great victory. The Lex Hortensia was adopted, declaring that resolutions passed by the plebeian assembly applied to all the people of Rome. This gave the tribune of the plebs, who called the assembly, similar legislative power to the consuls, a friction point which would prove unsustainable in the long term. For some time, the Senate and the assemblies seem to have worked quite well together. As a general principle, the Senate did not interfere in assembly affairs, and in return the people granted the Senate such respect that its resolutions, the Senatus Consulta, had the unofficial force of law. This harmony, however, all but collapsed in the mid to late 2nd century BC due to a variety of factors, including the concentration of wealth and political power resulting from Rome's dramatic rise on the world stage. At first, disagreements were handled using the law and in accordance with the mos maiorum, or the way of the ancestors. But as tensions mounted between factions such as the populares and the optimates, the law was increasingly twisted by either side looking to gain an edge. Bit by bit, political norms frayed until the law itself was stretched to the breaking point. Great disputes repeatedly flared up over agrarian laws which dealt with land and wealth distribution. Soon, you had tribunes and consuls both passing laws aimed at undermining one another's efforts. This tit-for-tat gridlock ultimately led some to seek solutions outside of the law. Violence was the ultimate result, which eventually led to the fall of the Republic. But before we get there, I did want to mention another very important development in the law of the late Republic. This would be the rise of the jurists. In essence, they were a semi-professional class of legal experts who emerged to deal with the increasing complexity and technicality of Roman law. Their efforts were significant in that for the first time, Rome had individuals who treated the study of law much like a science. They thoroughly examined precedent and the actual text of the laws in order to act as premier legal specialists in a world where there was no one place where someone could actually look to find the law. Thus, anytime a new law was passed or a case was heard by the courts, jurists would be there to offer learned commentary. They gave advice on questions, helped with filling out forms, drafted legal documents, and educated those who wished to follow in their footsteps. Thus, in the late Republic, we see the foundation being laid for a true legal community. The chaos and civil war which brought down the Republic certainly complicated matters when it came to the law. To put things bluntly, might made right, and everything else was a facade. Finally, in 31 BC, Augustus defeated Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium to emerge as the undisputed master of Rome. Yet Augustus knew that the people would reject a monarch and thus devised a means to cloak his power within the old republican system. This was achieved by restoring the traditional offices, public assemblies, and voting. At the same time, however, Augustus would be uniquely granted legal powers which had previously been divided across several positions. In this way, he could avoid wearing the toxic crown of dictator, and instead wear multiple, minor, discrete crowns, which together actually wielded the same, if not more power. Thus Augustus reigned humbly as the princeps, or the first man of the Senate, whilst actually playing the role of puppet master. Though this may seem quite tyrannical, in the context of the recent civil wars, it was quite an elegant and effective way to restore law and order. But power, once consolidated, is difficult to disperse, and the Roman Republic made its transition to empire. So how did the law work in this era? Well, for starters, you still had a lot of holdover from the Republican days in the form of customary and written law. At the beginning, new changes were not directly legislated by the princeps. Instead, he used his tribunate powers to call the assembly and propose a law, to which the Senate would then grant its approval. Alternatively, he would call the Senate and have them issue a senatus consultum, which quickly gained the power of an official law. While this hypothetically offered more power to the Senate, in reality, it only helped the emperor to expedite his decrees. His control over the Senate was so complete that these senatus consulta were seen as having come directly from the emperor himself, and oftentimes it was simply more convenient for him to summon the Senate than it was for him to call the assembly. Over time, these formalities fell away, and the entire assembly was dissolved before the end of the 1st century. The edicts of the emperor became law unto themselves, eschewing the formalities that were required when the empire was young. But even if the way in which laws were passed became simpler, the body of laws was increasingly complex. As we stated before, there was no one place to find what the law said. Instead, you had to look through an entire library of texts in Rome, refer to court precedent, and examine magisterial edicts, all of which could overlap and contradict. In addition, you had all the complexities of dealing with non-citizen subjects of the empire and foreigners, a category of law which we've barely even touched on. As you can imagine, it was quite the mess. This is where the jurists made a triumphant return to bring some semblance of order to the law. But of course, they would not be allowed to do so without some mechanism of imperial control. To this end, Augustus had created something called the power of speaking with the authority of the princeps, which he issued to a handful of the most prominent jurists. Other jurists were certainly allowed to continue practicing, and judges were not explicitly required to follow the decision of the chosen jurists. But in practice, it was nearly impossible for a judge to ignore the writ of the emperor. In the case of a disagreement between two ordained jurists, a judge would choose the more relevant opinion. Over time, these jurists took on a more formal role in the legal process and evolved into something that we would recognize today as lawyers. They gave counsel to magistrates, officials, and judges. They assisted civilians in drafting legal documents and transactions. They advised litigants, argued cases in court, and were professional teachers of the law, which had become a formalized part of the Roman education system. Perhaps most important of all, they wrote extensive treatises and textbooks on the theory of law itself. Their work was fundamental to the expansion of Roman jurisprudence and played a key part in the management of the empire. In fact, many of these works would be captured in the famous Code of Justinian of the 6th century AD. Ultimately, Roman law, honed over the centuries, would prove foundational to the success of not only their civilization, but the many civilizations which followed in their footsteps. Even today, we can find many echoes of Roman law in the civil law and common law systems practiced across the world, or in the Latin terms used to describe all sorts of legal principles. There is so much more to discuss when it comes to law and order in the ancient world, but today this is where we will end our episode. Stay tuned for more fascinating videos in this series where we'll be covering topics like Roman courts, police, jails, and more. A huge thanks to all of our patrons who help fund this channel, and all the researchers, writers, and artists who made this video possible. See you in the next one.